If you've ever watched a fantasy romance and thought, okay, but what if the one night that changes everything actually had consequences that hurt for years? Then deny me, Dragon King is basically designed to grab you by the throat and not let go. Because the emotional core of this drama isn't the dragons, or the castles, or the prophecy scrolls soaked in candle wax. It's a single decision made in the fog of fear and pride. A man with a crown believing a lie because it's easier than admitting he wants a human woman more than he wants to be obeyed. You're watching Cinenomad Review, and yes, I'm going full spoilers on this one, because honestly, the way this story detonates only really shines when we can talk about the whole messy chain reaction. If you like deep dive drama talk, feel free to subscribe for more, because this series gave me a lot to chew on, and I'm not even pretending I'm normal about it. I loved this drama. Not in a everything is flawless way, more like in a this show understands the shape of heartbreak way. It's romantic, it's cruel, it's weirdly tender when you least expect it, and it's structured like a wound that keeps reopening until somebody finally chooses to stop touching the bruise. The setup sounds almost archetypal on paper. Lyra, a human woman with that particular kind of quiet stubbornness that fantasy dramas love to punish, stumbles into the orbit of Kale, the Dragon King. He's not just powerful, he's ceremonial power. The kind of ruler whose every breath is politicized, whose emotions are treated like state secrets, whose body is basically a national monument. And then the drama does the thing that could have been cheap, except it isn't. They share one passionate night. Yes, it's shot like a dream you don't want to wake up from, and the next morning doesn't come with the usual oops, misunderstanding fluff. It comes with a prophecy. A prophecy that isn't real. And Kale falls for it. Here's what impressed me right away. Deny me, Dragon King doesn't portray Kale's mistake as random stupidity. It makes it ideological. This man has been trained, his entire life, to treat fate like law, to treat signs like evidence, to treat his own desire like a dangerous animal that needs to be leashed before it ruins the kingdom. So when a priestly faction presents him with a warning that a human lover will be his downfall, he doesn't just believe it, he clings to it. Because it gives him permission to do the cowardly thing while calling it duty. And Lyra. God. The way the show frames Lyra in those early episodes is quietly devastating. She's not naive, exactly. She just doesn't understand the rules of Dragon Court yet. She doesn't know that affection is currency, that vulnerability is a weapon someone else can pick up and use against you. She thinks one honest night means something. And it does. Just not in the way she expects. There's a moment early on, blink and you'll miss it, that tells you everything about their dynamic. Kale is standing at this open balcony, dawn light hitting the edges of his hair, and Lyra comes up behind him. She doesn't touch him right away. She hovers, like she's asking permission without speaking. He feels her there, and for half a second his shoulders drop, like his body recognizes peace before his brain can veto it. Then he turns, and the mask is back. That physical switch is doing so much acting heavy lifting, and it's the first time you understand, this isn't just a love story. It's a story about someone who's been trained to betray himself. And just when you're settling into the forbidden romance grooves, the show pulls the rug. The prophecy arrives like a sealed sentence. The court priests, all silver embroidery and calm eyes, tell Kale that the Dragon King who binds himself to a human will dilute the flame, doom the bloodline, fracture the realms. It's presented not as advice but as inevitability. And Kale, who should question it because he just lived something real, chooses the easier route. He throws Lyra out. Not gently. Not with explanation. He denies her. That title isn't poetic. It's literal. And if you're thinking, okay, but why is this the kind of show I keep watching? It's because the drama commits to the emotional realism of what happens next. Lyra doesn't get a dramatic revenge montage. She doesn't immediately become a swordswoman. She doesn't stumble into a new love interest who makes Kale jealous in episode 3. She walks out of that palace in shock, carrying humiliation like it is weight, and the world beyond the castle is cold in a way that feels physical. The cinematography here is doing quiet violence. Inside the Dragon Palace, everything is warm golds and heavy shadows, firelight, polished stone, velvet darkness. Outside, the palette drains. The sky looks like wet ash. The wind is loud. The edit holds on Lyra longer than is comfortable. No music telling you what to feel. Just the sound of her breath and the crunch of gravel under her boots. This is one of those directing choices that tells you, no, you're not getting to skip the aftermath. And then the show hits you with the consequence that makes the entire premise sharpen into something more adult. Lyra is pregnant. She bears his daughter. Half dragon. Amber. And I need to talk about how smart it is that the show doesn't treat Amber as a twist. Amber is not a plot coupon. She is the living embodiment of the night Kale tried to pretend didn't matter. The show understands that a child isn't just a tie between leads. It's a person who will grow up inside the fallout of their parents' choices. Years pass. The drama actually lets time sit there, which I appreciated. We see Lyra building a life in the human territories, in the border towns that feel like they were designed by people who assume winter will always return. There's a rhythm to her survival, trading herbs, repairing roofs, keeping her head down when soldiers come through. And woven into that is the constant, quiet management of Amber's differences. Amber is not just a kid with a secret. She's a child whose body sometimes tells on her. A fever that burns too hot. Eyes that flash ember gold when she's scared. A breath that fogs the air on warm days. The show handles it with restraint. It's not trying to be cute about it. It's closer to the feeling of parenting a child with a condition you can't fully control, except the condition is literal dragon fire. And then Amber gets sick. This is where Deny Me, Dragon King transforms from romantic angst fantasy into something that, for me, was almost unbearably effective. It becomes a story about what you're willing to swallow for your child. Pride. Fear. Trauma. The need to be right. Lyra doesn't return to Kale because she wants to. She returns because she has to. She needs a healer, specifically someone who understands dragon physiology, dragon magic, the old flameblood ailments that humans don't even have names for. Amber's sickness isn't a normal illness. It's like her two halves are at war with each other. Her veins run too hot. Her heartbeat goes strange at night. Sometimes she sleeps and the candle flames in the room flicker like they're breathing with her. And the show makes a brilliant choice. Lyra's return isn't framed like a triumphant march. It's framed like walking back into the house where you were once thrown out, except now you have a child holding your hand and you're trying not to let your anger leak through your fingertips. When Lyra crosses into dragon territory again, the camera goes wider. The landscape changes. The mountains look like teeth. There's this low, constant hum in the sound design, like distant thunder, like something alive under the earth. Even if you're not thinking consciously about it, your body is being told. You're entering a place where the rules were never made for you. And Kale. Kale has been living with his own version of rot. This is where the writing surprised me, because it doesn't do the easy thing where Kale is fine and just misses her wistfully. No. Kale is reigning, yes, but is hollowed out by his own decision. The court got what it wanted, a king who is pure, unentangled. And you can see the cost. His throne room scenes feel colder than they should. The fire braziers are lit, but the light doesn't seem to reach him. There's a repeated visual motif where Kale is framed behind veils, curtains, smoke, latticework, like the show is constantly reminding you that even in his own home, he's separated from intimacy. And then Lyra appears. Not in a glamorous entrance. No slow-motion hair flip. She shows up looking tired. Practical. Protective. She has that look some parents get when sleep has become a rumor. Her eyes go straight to the guards, then straight to Kale, and she doesn't bow low enough to soothe anyone's ego. And that's when the old sparks reignite, but not as romance. Not yet. It's like striking flint. It's heat plus friction. The reunion scene is one of the best acted sequences in the entire drama, because it's two people trying to keep their emotions from becoming weapons in a room full of witnesses. Kale's face does that thing where he almost softens, and then remembers he's being watched. Lyra's expression is controlled, but her jaw keeps tightening like she's biting down on things she wants to scream. He says her name like it's a word he hasn't been allowed to speak. She doesn't answer the way he wants. And Amber is there, half hidden behind Lyra's skirt, peeking out at this stranger who looks like a story her mother refused to tell. If you want to know whether this show is worth your time, it's right here. It understands that the most painful confrontations aren't the shouting matches. They are the polite ones. The ones where you smile with your mouth and bleed with your eyes. Now, of course, the plot doesn't just sit in that tension. We get jealous rivals. Political teeth. People who don't want Lyra back in the palace, and definitely don't want a half-dragon child complicating succession. And I have to talk about the rivals because this is where the drama could have gone generic. Evil jealous woman, scheming advisor, blah blah, and instead it gives us something a little more interesting. Kale has this court figure, Serafa, who's basically positioned as the perfect match candidate. She's dragon-blooded, noble, trained in court etiquette, and she understands the performance of being queen like it's choreography. But Serafa isn't written as cartoonish. She's not jealous because she's petty, she's jealous because she's invested. She has spent her entire life being shaped for a role, and then a human woman walks in and threatens to rewrite the script without even trying. That kind of resentment is so much more human than cackling villainy. And then there's the priestly faction, the ones behind the prophecy. They're terrifying because they don't feel like bad guys. They feel like institutions, like systems that survive by convincing you their lies are sacred. When Lyra asks about a healer, the court's immediate instinct is to gatekeep, to test her, to make her beg. The show leans into that humiliation, and I'll be honest, I was furious during these episodes. Like, genuinely, I had to pause and walk around my room at one point because the injustice was making my skin hot. Which sounds dramatic, but that's the point. This drama is pushing on that nerve of how many times can someone be asked to prove their humanity. Lyra's ask is simple, help my child. And the court turns it into a negotiation. Cale's inner conflict during this stretch is what makes the story addictive. Because he's not just dealing with Lyra's presence. He's dealing with the fact that she's back for their child, and he didn't even know he had one. There's guilt, yes. There's longing. But there's also this defensive anger, and the show is brave enough to let him be ugly about it sometimes. He asks questions that aren't really questions. Why didn't you come sooner? Why didn't you tell me? Is she mine? And Lyra's I say, you don't get to interrogate me like you didn't throw me out into the cold. That's the dynamic. Both of them are right about some things. Both of them are wrong about others. And the show doesn't rush to resolve that discomfort. Can we talk about Amber for a second, though? Because child characters can be such a gamble. They can either feel like props, or they can hijack the tone. Amber is neither. Amber feels like a real kid, curious, wary, occasionally funny in that blunt way children are, but also carrying a quiet tension because she senses the adults are lying. There's a small scene, one of my favorites, where Amber is in a courtyard with carved stone dragons, and she reaches out to touch one because it looks like her in a way she can't articulate. Her fingers linger on the stone scales. The sound design brings in this faint crackle, like a fire trying not to start. Lyra sees it and gently pulls her hand back, not harshly, just carefully. Like you'd move a child away from a hot stove without making them feel ashamed for being curious. That's parenting. That's love under pressure. And then Cale sees that interaction from a distance. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't announce himself. He just watches, and the performance sells the heartbreak without a single line. His hand flexes at his side like he wants to reach out but doesn't trust himself. The camera frames him behind a pillar, half in shadow, and for a second you're not looking at a king. You're looking at a man realizing he has missed entire years of someone's life. This is where the show's theme really starts to crystallize. Denial as self-harm. Denial as state policy. Denial as a generational curse. Because Cale didn't just deny Lyra. He denied the part of himself that chose her. And now that denial has a name and a face and a feverish child's breath. The healer thread is also more layered than I expected. It's not just find magic doctor. The healer they seek, Iowan, is this almost mythic figure, an outcast dragon mage who left court years ago. People talk about Iowan like a rumor. Like someone who knows secrets about bloodbinding and mixed lineage that the court would rather bury. And that becomes the show's engine. Lyra needs Iowan to save Amber, but getting to Iowan means navigating the very court that once used prophecy to ruin her life. Meanwhile, Cale is being pulled in three directions. His duty to tradition, his guilt toward Lyra, and his instinct to protect Amber even before he's fully allowed himself to call her his daughter. Now, let me drop you into one of the most cinematic scenes in the drama, because this is the moment I realized Deny Me, Dragon King was playing at a higher level than a lot of fantasy romance shows. It's night. There's a storm pressing against the palace windows, not in a loud way, but in this steady, threatening hush. Amber's fever spikes. Lyra is in a guest chamber that feels intentionally too nice. Soft bed, silk curtains, the kind of hospitality that's actually surveillance. She's sitting on the floor because she can't stand to lie down. Amber is on the bed, cheeks flushed, breathing shallow. Every time Amber exhales, the candle flames on the nearby table tremble like they're scared. The score is barely there. Just a low string note that feels like a held breath. Lyra dips a cloth into water and presses it to Amber's forehead. Her hands are shaking, but her voice is steady. whispering comfort like a spell she made up out of desperation. Amber murmurs something, half words, half heat, and the air in the room ripples. The camera does this tight close-up on Lyra's eyes, and you can see her trying not to cry because crying would mean losing control. Then the door opens. No dramatic slam. Just the soft click of wood. Kale steps in. He's not wearing the full regalia. No crown. No armor. Just dark fabric, hair slightly damp from the rain, like he came here without telling anyone. And he freezes when he sees Amber like that. Because whatever political calculations he's been doing all day, none of them prepared him for the reality of a small body in pain. Lyra stands up too fast, like a cornered animal. She blocks the bed with her body. Kale doesn't approach right away. He takes one step, then stops, like he's afraid his presence will make things worse. He looks at Amber, then at Lyra. He opens his mouth, closes it. And when he finally speaks, it's not kingly. It's raw. Is she burning? Lyra's response is a blade wrapped in cloth. She's been burning for days. There's no healer. There are only prayers and policies. Kale flinches, and the actor sells it like a physical impact. Another thunder roll, distant. Amber whimpers, and without thinking, Kale's hand lifts, palm open, instinctively reaching toward the bed. He catches himself mid-motion. His fingers curl like he's grabbing at air. That tiny interrupted gesture, God, that's the kind of performance detail that makes a scene live in your head. Lyra sees it. For a fraction of a second, her anger wavers. Not because she forgives him. Because she sees that he's terrified. Kale whispers, almost to himself, I didn't know. Lyra's eyes shine, and her voice drops. You chose not to. And then, because the show is cruel in the best way, Amber opens her eyes, half-lidded, fever-glazed, and she looks straight at Kale and says, in this tiny, strained voice, your fire hurts. Not Dad. Not King. Just that. Your fire hurts. The room goes still. Even the music cuts out. Kale's face collapses into something like grief. And Lyra, who has been holding herself together with rage and adrenaline, finally lets one tear fall. Just one, like her body can't negotiate anymore. That scene is Deny Me, Dragon King in a nutshell. Intimacy born from pain, truth spoken by the only person who can't be politically careful. So, yeah, I was in. What's fascinating is how the drama uses the hidden blood ties element not just as a soap twist, but as a thematic knife. Because Amber being Kale's child isn't just scandalous, it threatens the myth the court has been selling about purity and prophecy. A half-human heir is living proof that the bloodline can evolve. That the kingdom's fear of dilution is just fear. Which is why people start plotting. And these plots don't come from one mustache-twirling villain. They come from a web of incentives. Serafa has her own ambitions and her own wounds. The priestly faction wants control. The nobles fear instability. Even some of Kale's allies are like, we can love you, my king, but we cannot afford this. It gets messy in a way that feels true to how power works. Everyone tells themselves they're protecting the realm. Everyone thinks they're the hero of their own compromise. Lyra's presence in the palace becomes this constant provocation. Not because she's loud, but because she refuses to disappear. She's not trying to overthrow anyone. She just won't be erased again. And I need to acknowledge something. If you're the type of viewer who cannot stand male leads who make catastrophic choices early on, Kale is going to test you. This drama asks you to sit in the consequences of his failure for a long time. It does not let him earn redemption quickly. In fact, the most satisfying moments are the ones where he doesn't get what he wants. Like when he tries, awkwardly, to offer Lyra a more official room, more servants, more protection. He frames it like generosity. Lyra sees it for what it is, control disguised as care. She refuses. Calmly. In front of witnesses. And you can see Kale's pride want to flare, and then you see him swallow it. Those are the steps of change the drama is interested in. Not grand apologies. Small humiliations willingly endured. Now here's a question that kept nagging at me, and I want you to sit with it too. Is Kale's initial betrayal actually worse because it was for duty? Because he didn't throw her out in a moment of petty anger. He did it with a clean conscience. There's a particular kind of harm that comes from being hurt by someone who thinks they're righteous. Deny Me, Dragon King understands that. It treats that as its central poison. And the writing gives Lyra room to be contradictory about it. She hates him. She misses him. She despises the court. She's relieved to be inside walls again because at least Amber is warm. She doesn't want Cale's touch. Her body remembers it anyway. The drama never shames her for that mess. There's a scene where she's washing her hands at a basin after a tense court meeting, and Cale appears behind her, not touching, just there, and the camera focuses on Lyra's hands gripping the edge of the stone bowl. Her knuckles go white. You can tell she's grounding herself so she doesn't shake. Cale quietly says, "I can't undo what I did." And Lyra answers, not turning around, "Then stop trying to buy your way out of it." That line hit me because it's such a grown-up kind of anger. It's not screaming. It's refusal. And then, because the show knows exactly when to twist the knife, it shows Cale trying to do better in ways he doesn't fully understand yet. He starts investigating the prophecy. He starts asking questions that nobody asked before because nobody dared. He revisits the archives. He confronts the priestly faction with this careful, lethal calm. He realizes, piece by piece, that the prophecy was manufactured, tricked, not by some outsider enemy, but from within. And I love that the show doesn't make him instantly smarter than everyone else. He's late. He's catching up to a truth Lyra has been living inside for years. That imbalance matters. Meanwhile, Amber's illness escalates. And this is where the pacing, for me, gets really effective. The romance is constantly being interrupted by the reality of a sick child. Which is exactly what should happen. The show refuses to let longing become the only plot. You'll get a scene where Cale and Lyra almost speak honestly, almost crack open their history, and then Amber coughs, or the palace alarms ring, or a messenger arrives with news that the northern clans are stirring. The drama keeps saying, love doesn't exist in a vacuum. Not when you're a parent. Not when you're a king. Not when the world is sharpened by politics. I also want to shout out the editing rhythm during the palace intrigue sequences. It's not frantic. It's measured, like the show wants you to feel the slow tightening of a net. Conversations linger just long enough to become uncomfortable. Reaction shots are used like accusations. When someone lies, the camera holds on the person who hears it, not the person who says it. That choice keeps you emotionally aligned with the people absorbing the damage rather than the people dealing it. And because I'm me, I have to say it, I'm a sucker for a well-shot hallway scene. This drama has a few of them. Long corridors, torchlight flicker, footsteps echoing like a heartbeat. Characters passing each other without speaking, but the tension is so thick you feel like you could peel it off the walls. I ate that up. Fully. No shame. Okay, maybe a little shame, but not enough to stop. Now, the jealous rival thread starts to get really interesting once Amber becomes more visible. Because Amber is not just a secret anymore. She's walking the palace grounds. She's curious about dragon carvings. She asks the wrong questions at the wrong time. Children do that. And suddenly the court can't pretend Lyra is a brief inconvenience. She's a mother. And the child is evidence. Seraph's jealousy, at this point, shifts into something colder. Not just I want Cale. It becomes I have to protect the kingdom from chaos, which is the most dangerous justification any character can have, because it lets them do anything. She starts pressuring the council. She starts aligning with the priestly faction, not because she worships them, but because they're useful. And Cale, in one of his best late early arc decisions, refuses to marry her. Not dramatically. Not cruelly. He just stops letting the court steer his body like it's public property. But he still hasn't apologized to Lyra in a way that counts. Because here's the thing. The drama understands that apology isn't a speech. Apology is a change in pattern. And Cale is only beginning. Lyra, meanwhile, is laser-focused on finding Iowan. She hears rumors, an exiled mage seen near the obsidian marshes, a figure with a cloak that smokes at the edges, a healer who can balance flame and flesh. Cale offers soldiers. Lyra refuses, because soldiers draw attention, and attention is how children get taken. There's a brutal little moment where Cale says, "You don't trust me." And Lyra answers, "I trusted you once. I learned." Not screamed. Not dramatic. Just factual. That's the kind of line that makes you stare at your wall for a second. And this is where I need to make my first slightly spicy statement, because I know some viewers will disagree with me. I don't actually think Lyra's coldness toward Cale is harsh. I think it's merciful. Hear me out. A lot of shows in this lane will make the abandoned heroine immediately warm up once the male lead suffers. They'll treat his regret like currency that buys her softness back. Deny me, Dragon King does not do that. Lyra doesn't perform forgiveness on demand. She gives Kale the chance to be useful. She lets him exist near Amber. She doesn't immediately turn his guilt into her job to soothe. That's not cruelty. That's boundaries. And if anything, it's the only way Kale has a shot at becoming worthy of them. Because if Lyra collapses too quickly into romance, Kale never has to confront the full weight of what he did. He gets to be misunderstood. He gets to be forgiven. He gets to be comforted. Lyra refusing to comfort him is, honestly, the first real gift she gives him as a person, not a king. She forces him to feel it. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, okay, so when does the show start revealing the blood ties and the deeper secrets? Keep that question warm, because the drama plants some deliciously ominous seeds around Lyra's own past. There are hints that Lyra's mother wasn't just a nameless villager. Lyra has a pendant she never takes off, etched with a symbol that looks suspiciously similar to the old dragon script on palace seals. There's a mid-early episode where a court historian looks at Lyra and goes pale, like he recognizes something he shouldn't. The camera doesn't linger on it for no reason. And the show does that thing I love. It lets you feel the machinery turning under the floorboards. Amber's sickness also starts to look less random and more targeted. Not by a person at first, but by the environment. Like the palace itself rejects her. Like the wards built to protect dragon purity are literally harming a mixed-blood child. Which is such a smart metaphor I almost got mad. Because yes, obviously, systems protecting tradition always hurt the people who don't fit inside them. The show makes that literal with magic. By the time Lyra and Kale finally leave the palace to search for Iowan, the story clicks into a road quest mode for a few episodes, and I was so grateful for the change of air. The world feels bigger. We get forests that glow faintly at night, rivers that steam in the cold, ruins that look like they were carved by claws rather than hands. The visual team really flexes here, using wide shots to make the characters look small against landscapes that don't care about their drama. And the relationship beats shift too, because when you take people out of courtrooms and put them beside campfires, they lose some of their armor. There's a camp scene where Kale tries to start a fire the human way, with flint and wood, because he's trying to not rely on his dragon flame around Amber. He fails. Spectacularly. Lyra watches for a while, then silently hands him a better piece of kindling. He takes it without pride. And for a second, there's almost a laugh between them. Almost. The show doesn't let it become cute. It lets it be small and human and then it moves on, because Amber coughs in her sleep and the tension returns like a tide. I also want to praise the sound design around Kale's power. When he uses dragon magic, it's not just a whoosh. It has weight. It sounds like deep wind through stone. When his eyes shift, subtly, not full monster mode, there's this faint crackle layered under the dialogue, like the air is ionizing. It makes his power feel less like a superpower and more like a force of nature he's constantly negotiating with. And that negotiation becomes central when Kale starts bonding with Amber. Not instantly. Not with a montage of dad moments. It's awkward at first. Amber doesn't trust him. Why would she? Lyra hasn't filled her head with hate, but she also hasn't romanticized him. Amber knows one thing. When she's sick, her mother holds her. This man is a stranger who smells like smoke and authority. There's a tiny exchange that wrecked me. Amber asks Kale, very plainly, "Did you make my mama cry?" And Kale pauses like he's been slapped by truth. He says, "Yes." Just that. No excuse. No, it was complicated. He swallows and adds, "I did." And Lyra is standing there, hearing him admit it to their child. The camera holds on Lyra's face and you see something flicker, anger, pain, and a strange relief that he said it out loud. That's a kind of validation that doesn't heal you, but it stops the gaslighting of silence. If you're wondering when I personally got emotionally compromised, like when I stopped being a cool reviewer brain and started being a person with feelings, it was around here. There's a moment when Amber falls asleep leaning against Kale's side during a carriage ride. Kale doesn't move for a full minute because he's scared to wake her. His hand hovers above her hair, not touching, like he's asking permission from the universe. And Lyra watches him, and you can see her fighting with herself. I'm not even going to pretend. I teared up. Not because it was sweet, but because it felt like grief. Like lost time made visible. As someone who's watched people in real life try to repair relationships after years of damage, that quiet hesitation, the fear of doing the wrong thing even when you're trying, hit me in a place I wasn't expecting. And here's the really wicked structural trick Deny Me, Dragon King pulls. Just as Kale starts to become someone you can almost root for, the drama forces him into choices that prove whether he's changed or he's just regretting. Because regret is easy. Change costs. When they finally find signs of Iowan, burned runes on trees, a trail that smells faintly like ash and wild herbs, the court catches up. Seraph's faction has been tracking them. The priestly order sends hunters under the guise of protection. And suddenly the road quest becomes a chase. The action here isn't constant, but when it hits, it's tense. The show keeps fights grounded in stakes rather than spectacle. Lyra isn't suddenly a warrior. She survives by being smart, by knowing terrain, by moving like someone who's had to avoid danger for years. Kale is powerful, but every time he uses too much flame, Amber reacts. Her breath stutters, her skin flushes, like his power destabilizes her balance. So Kale has to hold back. A king used to unleashing force has to learn restraint. That is character development written into action choreography, and I respect it so much. Now, the hidden blood ties surface element starts to creep closer around this point, and I'm not going to rush it because the drama doesn't. It drips it. It lets you notice patterns before it confirms anything. The pendant Lyra wears becomes important. Iowan's name becomes connected to an older scandal, something about a human woman long ago, something about a child hidden, something about the last time the court tried to erase a mixed blood line. And the question hanging over everything becomes, is Amber the first half-dragon child, or just the first one the court failed to kill? That's the kind of question that changes the temperature of the whole story. And when Iowan finally appears, the show doesn't make it triumphant. It makes it eerie. Iowan is living in a ruin that looks like it's been half melted by fire. The walls are black glass in places, like lightning struck sand and turned it into obsidian. Plants grow where they shouldn't. The air is too quiet. Even the birds keep their distance. Iowan isn't warm. Iowan isn't welcoming. Iowan looks at Amber like a puzzle and looks at Kale like a mistake that keeps repeating. And you can feel the drama preparing to crack open its biggest themes: bloodline as oppression, prophecy as propaganda, love as rebellion, and family as the one thing powerful enough to make a king kneel. Right as Iowan agrees to examine Amber, Kale takes a step forward and says, "Save her. Name your price." Iowan's eyes flick up, sharp as a blade, and they answer, "My price is truth." And that's where the story starts to get dangerous in a way that isn't about swords. Because truth is what Kale has avoided since episode 1. And Lyra has been carrying it alone. Iowan begins the healing process by doing something that feels almost like surgery, but with magic. They draw a circle of ash and salt. They have Amber lie in the center. They place stones at the cardinal points, each etched with old dragon script. The camera goes tight on Lyra's hands again. Always Lyra's hands, always the show reminding you what she's been holding. Kale stands on the opposite side, forced to be present but not in control. Iowan speaks quietly, and the sound design makes their voice feel layered, like it's echoing from somewhere deeper than the room. Amber's body arches. The candles flare. Then everything drops into this heavy silence where you can hear Lyra's breathing like it's the loudest thing in the world. Iowan looks at Kale and asks, "Do you know what you made?" And Kale, for once, doesn't answer with certainty. He says, "A child." Iowan's gaze hardens. A bridge. And if that line doesn't hook you into the next stretch of the drama, I don't know what will. Because from here, Deny Me, Dragon King stops being only about whether Kale and Lyra will reconcile, and becomes about whether the kingdom will survive the truth of what Amber represents. Kale thinks he's fighting for his family. The court thinks it's fighting for stability. Lyra thinks she's fighting for her child's life. Iowan is fighting for something older, the right for mixed blood to exist without being treated as an accident. And in the middle of all that is Amber, a little girl who didn't ask to be symbolic, who just wants to breathe without pain. The next sequence, Iowan's diagnosis, the revelation of what Amber's sickness actually is, and the first real confirmation of who has been manipulating prophecy, kicks off the most emotionally brutal run of episodes in the whole drama, because it forces Kale to confront the one thing kings hate most. Not enemies. Not war. Consequences. And the moment Kale realizes the prophecy was fake, that he destroyed his own happiness for an institutional lie, the show doesn't let him turn that realization into instant heroism. It makes him sit in the shame. It makes him face Lyra's stare. It makes him realize that even if he tears down the priestly order tomorrow, he still cannot give Lyra back the years she spent alone, frightened, and proud enough to keep moving anyway. And watching a powerful man realize that power can't undo harm, that's where this drama becomes something I'm going to remember. Iowin's ritual reaches a pause, and they tell Lyra, very plainly, that Amber can be saved, but not in the palace. Not under wards built to reject her. Not under the court's gaze. They need to go somewhere older than politics. Somewhere the first dragons were born. Somewhere the flame is wild enough to accept contradiction. Cale hears that and immediately thinks of the sanctum, the ancestral volcano temple the royal line uses for coronations and blood oaths. Lyra hears that and thinks, trap. And that's the tension that makes the next leg of this story so electric, because even when Cale finally wants to do the right thing, Lyra has every reason not to trust his definition of right. Cale says, "It's sacred. No one will touch you there." Lyra says, "Sacred has never meant safe for people like me." And honestly, she's correct. They leave Iowin's ruin with Amber weakened but stabilized, and the chase begins again, only now the stakes are sharper because the priestly faction realizes Iowin has been contacted. They can't allow the truth to spread, and they definitely can't allow Amber to survive long enough to become a banner. The drama at this point is balancing romance, thriller, and political fantasy, and it's doing it with a confidence that made me lean forward. Because you can feel the writers going, okay, you're invested now. Let's see if you can handle what we are actually saying. And just as Cale begins to act like a father rather than a monarch, the story puts Amber in a situation where Cale has to choose between saving his child quickly with raw dragon fire, or saving her safely by trusting Lyra's slower, human method. He hesitates. And that hesitation, half a second, a lifetime, becomes the kind of character beat that decides what kind of man he's going to be. He looks at Lyra. Really looks. Not like a king evaluating a subject. Like a partner begging for instruction without wanting to admit it. Lyra nods once. Cale lowers his hand. He lets Lyra lead. And that choice, quiet as it is the start of something that feels like redemption, if the world will let them have it. The journey to the sanctum is where Deny Me, Dragon King finds its second wind, and I want to be precise about why, because a lot of dramas hit this stretch and start spinning their wheels. The trick here is that the show changes what the destination means depending on who's walking toward it. For Cale, the sanctum is home. It's the place where his father knelt, where his grandfather knelt, where every Dragon King has burned a bit of himself into the stone as proof of loyalty. For Lyra, it's a furnace built by people who decided long ago that she doesn't count. And for Amber, it's the first place in her entire short life where her body doesn't feel like a mistake. 3 characters, 1 location, 3 completely different emotional temperatures. That's good writing. And it's the kind of thing you only notice on rewatch, when you realize the camera treats the mountain differently in each of their point of view shots. When Cale looks at it, the framing is low and reverent, the peak crowned in cloud. When Lyra looks at it, the composition tilts slightly, the mountain pressing in from the top of the frame like a weight about to fall. When Amber looks at it, the lens softens, the ash in the air catching light like snow. The climb itself takes almost 2 full episodes, and I know some viewers found that indulgent. I didn't. Those episodes are where the show does its most honest relationship work, because there's nowhere for anyone to hide. No throne room, no council, no servants to perform for. Just 3 people and a road that keeps getting steeper. There's a night sequence on that climb that I keep coming back to. They've made camp under a shelf of black rock, and Amber is asleep between them, wrapped in Cale's cloak because it's the warmest thing they have. Lyra is awake, keeping watch, and Cale is pretending to sleep but obviously isn't. Neither of them speaks for a long time. The fire pops. The wind moves through the pass with this hollow, flute-like sound that the sound designers clearly work hard on, because it feels ancient rather than atmospheric. Then Lyra says, without looking at him, "She used to ask about you." And Cale doesn't move. Doesn't turn. He just says, "What did you tell her?" Lyra takes her time. That you were far away. That the world was complicated. That some people are trapped by what they were born into. She adjusts the cloak over Amber's shoulder. "I never told her you sent us away. I wanted her to have a father she could imagine, even if she never got to have one she could touch." And Cale, this is the part that destroyed me, Cale starts to cry silently. No sound. His shoulders don't shake. There's just this glassiness that builds in his eyes and then spills, and he doesn't wipe it away because wiping it away would mean admitting it's happening. The actor playing Cale has been doing careful, contained work up to this point, and here he lets the container leak. It's not a big emotional aria. It's a man discovering that he was protected by the kindness of the person he wronged, and that this kindness is somehow worse than hatred, because it means she was still thinking about his dignity while she was starving. Lyra sees it. She doesn't comfort him. She just says, quietly, "Don't. She'll wake up." That's the whole relationship in one exchange. Restraint as survival. Love that has been forced to become logistics. Now, if you thought the show was going to let them arrive at the sanctum in peace, you have not been paying attention to how this drama structures its cruelty. Sarafa intercepts them 2/3 of the way up. And here's where I need to defend a character choice that a chunk of the fandom absolutely hated, because I think the show did something genuinely brave with Sarafa and people misread it as inconsistency. Sarafa arrives with a small force, not an army, which matters. She could have brought an army. She didn't. She brought enough soldiers to look serious and not enough to make it a slaughter. And if you watch her face during that confrontation, she's not there to kill a child. She's there to force a negotiation she thinks is the only thing standing between the kingdom and civil war. Her argument is legitimately compelling, and the writing doesn't cheat it. She tells Cale, flatly, that if he brings a half-blood child to the sanctum and the mountain accepts her, every noble house with a grievance will have a pretext. That the clans in the north have been waiting 3 generations for an excuse. That the priestly order will declare him corrupted, and there are enough believers in the outer provinces to turn that declaration into blood. She's not saying, "I want you." She's saying, "I have spent my life learning how this machine works, and you are about to put your hand in it." And Cale's answer is the first time in the entire drama that he sounds like a man instead of an institution. He says, "Then let it break." Sarafa stares at him, and the actress does this extraordinary thing where you can watch her recalculate her entire life in real time. Because she's not just losing a man. She's losing the logic that organized her existence. She was raised to be the correct choice, and she's standing in front of proof that correctness was never the point. The reason I defend her is that her jealousy is never separated from her grief. There's a scene right before this where she's alone in a tent, unpinning her hair, and the camera catches her hands trembling. Not with rage. With exhaustion. This is a woman who has never once been allowed to want something for a reason other than duty, and now she's watching someone else get to be loved messily, inconveniently, without earning it through protocol. That's not villainy. That's a person discovering she was never in a competition, only in a cage. A lot of viewers wanted her to be irredeemable so they could enjoy hating her. The show refuses. I think that refusal is one of its best instincts. The confrontation on the mountain ends without a fight, which surprised me and then delighted me. Lyra steps forward, and this is such a Lyra move, and instead of appealing to Sarafa's mercy, she appeals to her competence. She says, "You're the only person here who understands the council. If this goes wrong, they'll need someone who can hold it together." She hands Sarafa the responsibility instead of begging her for permission. Sarafa's face when she realizes she's just been outmaneuvered by a human woman with dirt on her hands is genuinely one of my favorite reaction shots in the year. There's fury in it, and grudging respect, and something like relief. She lets them pass. She also, crucially, sends a rider back with a message that will matter enormously later, and the show shoots that rider leaving with a lingering wide shot that basically screams, "Remember this." I did remember it. You should too. The Sanctum arrival is the drama's biggest visual swing, and it mostly lands. Imagine a caldera lit from below, terraces of black stone descending toward a lake of slow-moving fire, and above it all a ring of carved dragon statues so eroded by heat that their faces have gone smooth and featureless. That detail, the facelessness, is doing thematic work. The ancestors have been sanded down into abstraction. Nobody remembers who they actually were. They've become shapes onto which the living project whatever they need. The heat haze distorts everything. Characters blur at the edges. The score drops out almost entirely and is replaced by this deep, subsonic pulse, like a heartbeat you feel more than hear. When Amber steps onto the stone, the pulse changes rhythm. The mountain notices her. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't get chills. Iowan explains what's actually been wrong with Amber, and this is where the drama's central metaphor snaps fully into focus. Amber isn't sick because she's half human. She's sick because she's been living inside a kingdom whose wards, sigils, and blessings were specifically engineered to identify and suppress mixed blood. Every protective enchantment in the palace, every purification rite performed at the borders, every blessing the priestly order sprinkled over villages for centuries, they were all filters. And Amber's body has been swimming against that current since she was born, burning energy every hour of every day just to exist in a world calibrated to reject her. The illness isn't a disease. It's the cumulative cost of being unwanted at a structural level. I sat back when that landed, because it reframes everything. All those childhood fevers Lyra nursed her through in border towns? Those weren't random. Those were the wards at the checkpoints. The night Amber's fever spiked in the palace guest room? That was the strongest concentration of purity magic in the entire realm, humming through the walls 3 feet from her head. Kale put his daughter in the most dangerous building on the continent and called it hospitality. The show lets him realize this on camera, and the performance is a controlled demolition. He goes very still. Then he asks Iowan to repeat it. Then he asks again. And then he walks away from the group, out to the edge of the terrace, and he screams into the caldera, and the sound design mixes it so his voice is swallowed almost instantly by the heat and the space, this enormous release that goes absolutely nowhere. Even his grief doesn't get to echo. That's directing. Then comes the blood truth, and I want to walk through this carefully because the show earns it with about 15 episodes of quiet setup and it deserves better than a rush summary. Lyra's pendant. The historian who went pale. Iowan's exile. It all converges. Iowan takes the pendant, holds it up against the firelight, and asks Lyra where she got it. Lyra says her mother. Her mother got it from her mother. It's the only thing her family ever owned that wasn't practical. Iowan tells her the symbol is a house mark. Not a human one. 3 generations back, a dragon-blooded noblewoman fell in love with a human man. She bore a child. The court did what the court always does. It declared the child a corruption, the union a heresy, and the whole affair was scrubbed from record. The noblewoman was executed under a fabricated charge. The human man vanished. The child was smuggled out by a sympathetic servant and raised in the human territories with no idea what she was. That child grew up. Had a daughter. That daughter had Lyra. Lyra is not fully human. She never knew. Nobody knew. The blood ran thin enough to hide, thin enough that she never manifested anything, thin enough that she lived an entire life as an ordinary woman in an ordinary town. But it's there, dormant, waiting, which means Amber isn't a half-dragon child. Amber is a returning line. And Iowan is the sister of the woman who was executed, which makes them Lyra's blood, which is why they've spent decades in exile studying mixed lineage, why they knew exactly what to look for, why they looked at Kale with such contempt the moment he walked in. Iowan has watched this exact tragedy play out before. Same court. Same order. Same fabricated justification. Different bodies. The reveal lands in a scene that's almost unbearably quiet. Iowan tells Lyra, "You are the last of my sister's line, and they will do to your daughter what they did to her, unless someone finally makes them say it out loud." Lyra doesn't cry. She sits down on the hot stone like her legs have stopped negotiating, and she says, "My mother worked in a laundry until her hands cracked open." That line. God. Because it's not I'm royalty. It's my family was ground into dust by people who knew exactly who we were. The class rage in this drama is severely underrated, by the way, and I don't see enough people talking about it. Every noble in this story treats Lyra's poverty as evidence of her lesser nature, when her poverty is literally a consequence of their crime. They stole her family's name and then mocked her for not having one. Now, the prophecy conspiracy. This is where the drama connects its emotional spine to its political one, and it does it with a nasty elegance. The fake prophecy that Kale believed wasn't invented for Kale. It was recycled. The priestly order has a template. They deploy it every time the royal line drifts toward human blood, because the order's entire authority rests on being the interpreters of purity. If purity stops mattering, they stop mattering. They're not zealots protecting a sacred truth. They're a bureaucracy protecting a job description. Archseer Morin, the order's head, played with this awful gentle warmth by an actor who understands that the scariest people speak softly, is the one who forged it. And his motive isn't even grand. He didn't hate Lyra. He barely registered her. He saw a king becoming unpredictable and applied the standard correction. That's the horror. It was routine. When Kale eventually confronts him, Morin doesn't grovel and doesn't rage. He explains. Patiently. Like a man clarifying policy to someone who's being emotional about it. He says the order has preserved the realm through 6 accessions and 2 famines, and that stability requires certain fictions. He says Kale's father was managed the same way and never knew it. He says, and this line genuinely made my stomach turn, "You are not the first king to mistake his leash for his spine." And Kale's response is to ask him one question. What was her name? Morin doesn't know. He never learned it. He destroyed a woman's life and never bothered to find out what she was called. Kale doesn't kill him in that moment. That restraint is deliberate and it's the right call, even though I wanted violence so badly my jaw hurt. Because killing Morin would let the Order become martyrs. What Kale does instead is worse for them and better for the story, and I'll get to it. Before that, though, the Sanctum Ritual, which is the emotional apex of the entire drama and one of the best constructed sequences I've seen in fantasy television in a long while. Let me put you in it. Night, though night barely means anything in a caldera that glows. Amber is laid on a flat stone at the lake's edge, and she's so small against it. The composition makes sure you feel that, this tiny body on an altar built for creatures the size of houses. Iowan has drawn the circle. The wind has died completely, which the sound mix communicates by stripping out everything except breath and the low pulse of the fire below. Lyra kneels at Amber's head. Kale stands at her feet. Iowan explains the cost, and this is the part that makes the scene great. There is a cost, and it's not vague. To rebalance Amber's blood, someone has to give her a stable anchor of dragon fire. Not a spell, not a transfusion, but an actual portion of their own flame, permanently. Whoever gives it will be diminished. Not killed. Diminished. Weakened. Their fire will never fully return. For a dragon, that means shortened life, reduced power, and, Iowan says this deliberately, looking at Kale, the loss of the right to sit the throne, because the coronation rite requires a full flame. So Kale can save his daughter or he can be king. And here's what I adore. The show does not milk it. He doesn't deliberate for an episode. He doesn't have a soul-searching monologue. Iowan finishes the sentence and Kale is already rolling up his sleeve. Lyra grabs his wrist. Stops him. And she says the thing that made me put my hand over my mouth. Don't do it to make yourself feel better. Because that's the fear, right? That he'd turn even sacrifice into an act of self-absolution. That he'd hand over his flame and then expect the debt cleared. Kale looks at her, and he says, quietly, without any of the royal cadence is used for 20 episodes, I'm not doing it to be forgiven. I'm doing it because she's mine and I was late. And Lyra lets go of his wrist. The ritual itself is shot with almost no cutting. Long takes. The camera drifts around the circle in a slow arc, so you're always aware of the space and never given the relief of a reaction shot rhythm. Kale opens his hand and the fire that comes out of him isn't dramatic. It's slow, viscous, reluctant, like something being pulled out of a body rather than released. It's honestly a little grotesque, and that's the right choice. Sacrifice should look like it hurts. Amber's back arches. Her skin lights from within, veins glowing in this branching pattern up her arms and throat. Lyra holds her head and talks to her the entire time, the same made-up nonsense comfort from that fever night in the palace, and the callback lands like a hammer. Kale goes to his knees halfway through. Keeps going. His eyes lose their ember shine. Literally, the color drains out of them, and the show lets you watch it happen in a single unbroken close-up. By the end, he's a man with ordinary brown eyes, breathing hard, sweat cutting tracks through the ash on his face. Then silence. Then Amber opens her eyes. And she says, it's quiet. Because for the first time in her life, nothing in the world is pushing against her. I lost it. Genuinely. I had to pause and go get water and stand in my kitchen for a minute. Not because it was sad, but because of that specific word, quiet. A child describing the absence of pain as silence. That's a level of writing detail that tells me somebody on that team understood something real about living in a body that fights you. The aftermath is where a lesser drama would coast, and deny me, Dragon King instead does its most interesting political work. Kale, no longer eligible for the throne by the Order's own rules, returns to the capital and does something nobody expects. He doesn't fight the disqualification. He accepts it, publicly, loudly, in front of the full council, and then he uses the platform to detonate the archive. Because here's what he's been doing quietly for 6 episodes, gathering records. Every fabricated prophecy. Every scrubbed name. Every mixed-blood child the Order resolved. 3 centuries of it. And he reads them aloud. Names, dates, methods. He stands there, powerless, flameless, no longer king, and he reads a list of the dead into a room full of people who profited from their erasure. The staging of that scene is deliberately unglamorous. Flat lighting. No score. The camera mostly static, occasionally cutting to nobles who can't hold eye contact. It plays less like a triumphant speech and more like a deposition. Which is exactly right, because the show understands that dismantling an institution isn't a sword fight. It's paperwork read out loud by someone who has nothing left to lose. Morin's downfall isn't a duel. It's the slow, humiliating collapse of credibility. The Order fractures. Younger priests defect. The provinces that were supposed to rise up in righteous fury instead start producing their own hidden histories. Families who'd buried mixed children, villages that had been purified, a whole subterranean archive of grief that had no language until someone in power finally said the words. That's a much more mature ending than the hero kills the bad guy, and I want to give the writers real credit for having the nerve to go there, because it's a harder sell. Sarafa's endgame is where the show cashes in on all that earlier nuance. That rider she sent from the mountain? He carried a full account of the interception to a specific council member, her mentor, a woman who has been quietly documenting the Order's overreach for years. Sarafa wasn't just chasing Kale on that mountain. She was building a record. She didn't know what she'd do with it. She just knew that when everything broke, someone would need proof. So when Kale reads his list, Sarafa stands up and corroborates it, under her own name, knowing it destroys her standing with half the houses that raised her. Is it redemption? Sort of. The show is careful. She doesn't get a warm reconciliation with Lyra. There's no tearful hug. What she gets is a single scene, late, where she and Lyra pass each other in a corridor and Sarafa says, "I still don't like you." And Lyra says, "You don't have to." And Sarafa nods, and keeps walking, and that's it. That's the entire resolution of their rivalry, and it is so much more satisfying than forced sisterhood. Which brings me to the thing I've been circling, the reconciliation between Lyra and Kale, and whether the drama earns it. Mostly, yes. With one caveat I'll get to. The show does not do a grand romantic reunion. There's no rain-soaked confession, no running through crowds. Instead there's a sequence over the final 2 episodes where Kale simply keeps showing up. He has no title. He has diminished power. He's living in a modest house near the border because Lyra refuses to move back to the capital and is not going to make her. He learns to do things. Badly at first. He chops wood and does it wrong for a week before someone shows him the angle. He walks Amber to the village school and stands too straight and makes the other parents nervous. He does the dishes. He is, in the most literal sense, deposed. And the drama frames domesticity not as a come-down but as a curriculum. There's an episode where a neighbor's roof needs repair and Kale goes to help, and is up there hammering shingles in the rain, and Lyra watches from the ground with an expression I could not name for a full minute. It's not love, exactly. It's something closer to disbelief. The disbelief of watching someone become an ordinary person who is actually present, after years of being abandoned by someone extraordinary who wasn't. The moment she finally lets him in isn't a kiss. It's smaller. Amber has a nightmare, and Lyra goes to her room and finds Kale already there, sitting on the floor by the bed, half asleep against the wall, because he hurt her first. Lyra stands in the doorway. She watches. And then she comes in and sits down on the floor next to him, shoulder to shoulder, and doesn't say anything. That's it. That's the reunion. 2 exhausted parents on a cold floor. And I think it's beautiful, and I think it's correct, and I think a certain segment of the audience found it anticlimactic, and I understand why, but I disagree with them completely. This is a story about a man who destroyed a woman with a grand dramatic gesture. Healing it with another grand dramatic gesture would have been thematically incoherent. The repair had to be boring. It had to be repetitive. It had to be pattern, not performance. Now, my caveat. The final episode does rush one thing, and it bugs me. Lyra's own dragon blood, the dormant line, the inheritance, gets acknowledged and then essentially shelved. There's a brief moment where Iowan suggests it could be awakened, and Lyra declines, and the show treats that as a complete character resolution. I actually like the refusal in principle. Lyra choosing to remain who she's always been rather than accept a power that comes from the same system that destroyed her family is thematically sharp. But it happens in about 90 seconds of screen time in the penultimate episode, and after 20 episodes of build-up, 90 seconds is not enough. I wanted a whole conversation. I wanted her to be tempted. I wanted to see her look at the fire and want it and say no anyway. Instead, the show gives us the conclusion without the deliberation, and it's the one place where I felt the writers checking a box. The other structural wobble, and I'd be dishonest if I skipped it, is the midsection. Episodes 11 through 14, roughly. The court intrigue gets repetitive in there. There are at least 3 separate council scenes that accomplish the same narrative function, establishing that the nobles are nervous and Kale is losing leverage. You could cut one entirely and lose nothing. The show also introduces a Northern Clan subplot in that stretch that never quite pays off proportionally to the setup it receives. There's a whole thread about a border warlord that ends up being resolved off-screen with a line of dialogue, which is the storytelling equivalent of finding a plot thread in your pocket after laundry. I bring these up not to knock the drama down, but because I think honest praise requires honest accounting. A show can be excellent and still have 4 episodes where you check how much time is left. Both things are true. What the show never loses, even in that saggy stretch, is its performances. Let me talk about the lead actress, because she's carrying a genuinely difficult assignment. Lyra could easily have become either a saint or a shrew. The role requires her to be furious for 20 episodes without becoming exhausting, and to be loving without becoming soft, and to be poor without becoming pitiable. She threads it by playing Lyra as fundamentally practical. Every emotion gets filtered through what do I have to do next. Her anger never stops her hands from working. Her grief happens while she's folding clothes. Watch what she does with stillness. There's a scene in the palace where a noblewoman insults her lineage at a dinner, and Lyra just keeps eating. Slowly. Deliberately. She finishes her bite, sets down her utensil, and then looks up with an expression of polite inquiry, and the noblewoman folds like wet paper. No line delivered. Just a look and a pause and complete refusal to be rattled. And then watch what she does when she's alone. The same actress, 30 seconds later in the edit, in a corridor, one hand braced against the wall, breathing like she just ran a mile. The public composure was costing her the entire time, and we only find out afterward. That's the performance of the year for me, genuinely. It's not showy. It's architectural. The actor playing Kale has the flashier arc but the harder trap, because audiences arrive at a character like this already hostile. He has to earn back goodwill without begging for it. His solution is to play Kale as a man who is constantly, physically uncomfortable in his own authority. Watch his posture across the series. Early Kale stands like a statue, shoulders locked, chin level, hands still. By the sanctum he's hunched, restless, hands always doing something. By the final episodes he moves like a normal person, and the transformation is entirely physical. Nobody comments on it. It just happens over 20 hours. His best moment, for me, isn't the sacrifice. It's a tiny beat in the archive episode where he's reading the list of names and he mispronounces one, and he stops, and corrects himself, and says it again properly. Half a second. But it tells you everything about what is finally understood, that getting the name right is the entire point. The child actress playing Amber deserves her own paragraph, because child performances in fantasy dramas are usually a liability and she's an asset. She plays Amber with this quality of watchfulness that reads as genuinely lived in rather than precocious. She's not written as wise beyond her years, thank God. She's written as a kid who has learned to read adult faces because her survival has depended on it, which is a real thing that real children in unstable situations actually do. When she's happy, she's loud and clumsy and normal. When the room gets tense, she goes quiet and still. That contrast is the whole character. Iowan is the wildcard performance, and I'm still not sure I've decided how I feel. The actor plays them at a very low temperature, flat effect, minimal gesture, a voice that barely rises. It works beautifully in the ruin sequences, where the eeriness is the point. It works less well in the sanctum, where the emotional stakes need a partner to bounce off and Iowan stays glacial. There's a version of the blood truth scene where Iowan cracks, just slightly, when talking about their executed sister, and I think that version is better. As shot, the scene puts all the emotional labor on Lyra. She's up to it, but the imbalance is noticeable. Musically, the show is smarter than its genre usually allows. There's a main theme, obviously, and it's lovely, a low-string figure with this ascending phrase that never quite resolves. But the composer's best decision is how sparingly it's used. It doesn't play over every romantic beat. It plays over absence. It shows up when characters are apart, or when someone is remembering, or when a room is empty. By the time it finally plays over the two of them together, in the last episode, it's carrying 20 episodes of accumulated longing, and it just about knocks you over. There's also a recurring vocal motif, a wordless female voice, very high, almost like wind, that's associated specifically with the erased women. Lyra's great-grandmother. Iowan's sister. The names on the list. You hear it first in a scene that has nothing obviously to do with any of them, and then you hear it again during the archive reading, and the connection retroactively reframes the earlier scene. That's a composer and an editor working together on purpose, and I love finding that kind of thing. The one music choice I'd argue with is the use of a modern-styled song over the final montage. It's a good song. It's just tonally at odds with everything the show has built, and it pulls me out at the exact moment I want to be most immersed. 20 episodes of orchestral restraint and diegetic wind, and then suddenly we're in a soundtrack single. It's a small thing. It bothered me. Thematically, let's put the pieces on the table, because I think this drama is saying something more coherent than its marketing suggested. The obvious theme is denial. It's in the title. Cale denies Lyra, denies his desire, denies his child, denies his complicity. But the show extends it outward. The court denies its own history, the order denies the existence of the people it destroyed, and the kingdom denies that its purity was ever anything but a story. Denial as personal cowardice scaled up into denial as governance. Underneath that, though, there's a subtler theme about who is permitted to be a person versus a symbol. Amber spends the whole series being turned into a symbol by everyone. Iowan calls her a bridge, the Order calls her a corruption, the nobles call her a crisis, and even Cale initially thinks of her as proof of his failure. The only person who consistently treats Amber as a child is Lyra. And the drama's moral position is unambiguous. The woman who refuses to make her daughter mean something is the only adult in the story behaving correctly. That's why the ending isn't a coronation or a new order or Amber taking a throne. Some viewers wanted that. Some viewers wanted the half-dragon child to become queen and unify the realms, and I get the appeal. But it would have betrayed the whole point. Amber becoming a symbol of reconciliation is still Amber becoming a symbol. The ending they chose, Amber going to a village school, being annoying about vegetables, having a friend, getting in trouble for setting a hedge slightly on fire, is the ending the theme demands. The victory isn't that she matters to history. The victory is that she gets to not matter to history. I want to sit with the fire in the hedge thing for a second, actually, because it's the closest the show comes to comedy and it earns it. Amber, now healthy, has full access to her dragon side for the first time and absolutely zero control over it, and there's this delightful late sequence of her accidentally scorching things while Cale, flameless, patient, deeply out of his depth, tries to teach her regulation techniques he learned as a royal heir and which are completely inappropriate for a 9-year-old. He's giving her breathing exercises designed for coronation rituals. She's trying to eat soup. It's very funny and it's also quietly heartbreaking, because it's a man teaching his daughter the only fatherhood he ever received and slowly figuring out that none of it applies. Which, honestly, is the most universal thing in this entire dragon show. Every parent I know has had some version of that moment. You reach for the toolkit you inherited and discover it's the wrong shape. Let me offer my second genuinely contrarian read, because I've been thinking about it since I finished and I don't see it discussed much. I don't think Cale's original decision was primarily about the prophecy. The prophecy was the permission slip. The actual driver was class disgust, and the show is quietly honest about this even though Cale never admits it. Rewatch the early scenes with that lens. Look at how he touches her, reverently in private, and then, the morning after, how his eyes flick to her clothes. Look at the specific wording he uses when he dismisses her. Not "you are dangerous," but "you do not belong here." Look at how quickly he accepts the order's framing without demanding evidence. When this is a man who interrogates his generals about supply figures. He wanted an excuse and they handed him one. The reason I think this reading matters is that it makes his redemption arc more meaningful, not less. If the prophecy were the real cause, then discovering it was fake would be sufficient to fix him. Learn the truth, feel bad, reconcile. But the show doesn't let it work that way. He learns the prophecy is fake in episode 15 and is still not okay by episode 19, because the prophecy was never the disease. The disease was a lifetime of being taught that certain people are furniture. And the cure isn't information. It's living in a village where he's not the most important person in the room. I find that so much more interesting than he was tricked, poor guy. He was tricked, yes. But he was trickable for a reason, and the drama knows it, and it just declines to underline it, which is either brilliantly subtle or slightly underserved, depending on your mood. Eileen, brilliant. Here's a question I keep turning over, though, and I want to hear where you land on it. Does Lyra actually forgive him? I've watched the final episode twice, and I genuinely don't think the show says she does. It says she chooses to build something with him. Those aren't the same thing, and the drama seems very aware of the distinction. There's no scene where she says, "I forgive you." There's a scene where she says, "Amber should know you." There's a scene where she lets him stay. There's a scene where she takes his hand. But forgiveness? Never stated. Possibly never granted. And I think that's the boldest thing in the whole production. It suggests that some damage doesn't get erased, it gets integrated. You don't return to before. You build a different structure on top of the rubble and you agree, together, not to pretend the rubble isn't there. For a genre that usually treats reconciliation as a reset button, that's a genuinely adult position. Let me go back to craft for a bit, because there are directing choices in the back half I haven't given proper credit. The color grading arc across the series is deliberate and beautifully controlled. Early Palace episodes, warm gold, deep shadow, everything lacquered. Post-exile episodes, desaturated, blue-gray, cold light. The return to the palace brings the gold back, but it's subtly wrong, harsher, more brass than gold, less inviting. The road episodes introduce green for the first time in the entire show, which is such a simple trick and so effective. You physically relax. The sanctum is red-black and overwhelming. And the final village episodes settle into this soft, unremarkable natural light. No stylization at all. The visual argument is, the more real their life becomes, the less the frame tries to impress you. I also want to flag the show's use of doorways, which becomes almost a running motif once you notice it. Lyra is constantly framed in doorways, entering, leaving, hovering at thresholds. Early on it emphasizes her outsider status. She's never fully in a room. By the end, the doorway shots invert. She's the one inside, and Kale is the one at the threshold waiting to be invited. The final shot of the series is, appropriately, a doorway, with the camera inside the house, looking out at the three of them in the yard, and then the door slowly swings partway closed on its own in a breeze, cutting off our view. We don't get to keep watching. Their life stops being a spectacle. Perfect. The editing has one recurring flourish I'll mention because it's unusual. Match cuts on hands. Lyra's hands ringing a cloth cut to Kale's hands gripping a chair arm. Amber's small fingers on stone scales cut to Iowan's fingers tracing a rune. The show builds a whole visual vocabulary around what people do with their hands. Working, holding, reaching, withholding. And given that so much of the story is about touch that was denied and care that was withheld, it's thematically loaded rather than decorative. Pacing-wise, the season is structured as roughly 4 movements, and I think 3 of them are excellent. The opening, the affair, the betrayal, the exile, is compressed and brutal and gets you invested fast. The return to the palace is tense and claustrophobic and features the best dialogue writing in the show. The road and sanctum stretch is the emotional peak. The midsection council material, as I said, is the weak link, and if I were recutting this I'd tighten those 4 episodes into 3 and lose nothing but repetition. The final episode also makes a choice I want to note. It's almost entirely quiet. No action. No confrontation. The last hour of a fantasy drama about dragons and prophesies is basically a domestic drama about people learning to live together. I know that lost some viewers. For me, it was the payoff of a promise the show had been making since the 2nd episode, when it lingered on Lyra's face after her exile instead of cutting to spectacle. This drama always told you it cared more about aftermath than event. Something else worth saying, the show handles Amber's illness with a specificity that suggests somebody involved has real experience with chronic illness in a child. The exhaustion of it. The way Lyra can gauge Amber's temperature by touching the back of her neck without breaking conversation. The way she has 3 different plans for a bad night. The way she flinches at certain sounds, a particular cough pattern, before her conscious mind registers what she heard. That's not fantasy writing. That's observed. And it grounds the whole magical apparatus. The reason the metaphor lands, systems of purity making a child sick, is that the sickness itself is portrayed with unglamorous accuracy. It's not a beautiful wasting illness where she gets paler and more ethereal. She's sweaty. She's irritable. She throws up. She has bad days where she's mean to her mother and Lyra absorbs it because she knows it's the fever talking, and then Lyra goes outside and stands in the cold for a minute and comes back in. I've thought about that beat a lot. The going outside. The 1 minute. That's a whole novel in a gesture. Let me also give some credit to how the drama handles the intimacy between Cale and Lyra, because that opening night could have been either gratuitous or coy, and it's neither. It's shot with a lot of close framing and almost no wide shots, which makes it feel less like display and more like memory. And critically, the costumes have real texture and weight, but nothing in the visual arsenal stuck with me the way the small human observations did. Let me talk briefly about how it functions as a genre piece, for those of you who watch a lot in this lane and want the comparative read. Structurally, it's closer to a family melodrama wearing fantasy clothes than to an epic. The world building is functional rather than expansive. We get maybe 4 named locations and a rough sense of political geography, and that's it. If you come to fantasy for maps and lore and appendices, this will feel thin. There's no magic system to speak of beyond dragons of fire and priests of wards. The show is completely uninterested in mechanics, which is a legitimate choice and also a legitimate reason for some viewers to bounce off. I've seen complaints that the magic is inconsistent, and honestly, yeah, it kind of is. The rules of what Cale can and can't do shift according to dramatic need. Iowyn's abilities are whatever the scene requires. If that sort of thing bothers you, it will bother you here. But I'd argue the show is doing the same thing certain literary fantasies do, where the fantastical elements are essentially psychological. Cale's flame isn't a power set, it's a metaphor for inherited authority. Amber's illness isn't a disease, it's a metaphor for structural exclusion. Judging the magic system's consistency is a bit like judging the physics of a dream. Whether that satisfies you probably depends on what you came for. On the romance side, this is a slow burn with a very unusual shape, because the burn happens in reverse. Most slow burns build attraction toward consummation. This one starts with consummation and then spends 20 episodes building trust. That inversion is the show's cleverest structural idea, and I'd love to see more dramas try it, because it turns out that watching 2 people who already know each other's bodies negotiate whether they can know each other's minds is far more suspenseful than the usual will they won't they. There's a scene, episode 17, I think, where they are alone for the first time in a long while and the tension is unbearable, and the show plays it entirely straight-faced. They talk about supply routes. 6 minutes. About supply routes. And it is the most charged scene in the series, because you can feel both of them using logistics as a shield, and every time the conversation threatens to become personal, one of them steers it back. Finally, Lyra says something slightly warm, catches herself, and immediately asks about grain reserves. That's flirting as trauma response, and it's beautifully performed. I promised earlier I'd come back to the question of whether Cale deserves what he gets, so let me actually answer it. No. He doesn't. And the show knows he doesn't, which is why it takes the throne from him, takes his flame, takes his certainty, and gives him back nothing except proximity. He doesn't get a crown and a wife and a happy kingdom. He gets to live in a small house and be tolerated by a woman who has not said she forgives him and might never say it. He gets to watch his daughter grow up in a village where nobody bows to him. Is that a happy ending? For him, I think it's more like a sentence he's grateful to serve. And Lyra. Lyra gets her daughter alive and healthy. That's what she came for. Everything else, the truth about her lineage, the fall of the Order, Cale's presence, is incidental to her actual goal. The show is quite pointed about this. In the final episode, she's asked whether she got what she wanted, and she says, she's eating properly. That's it. That's her victory condition. I love that this drama gives its heroine a goal that is entirely non-romantic, and then lets the romance be a side effect. Something occurred to me on rewatch that I want to share because it slightly changed how I read the ending. Watch Lyra's behavior around fire across the series. Early on, she handles it casually. Cooking, hearths, candles, no reaction. After Amber gets sick, she becomes wary of it. In the palace, she instinctively moves Amber away from braziers. During the sanctum ritual, she watches the flame with open fear. And in the final episode, when Amber accidentally scorches that hedge, Lyra laughs. It's the first time in 20 episodes we hear her laugh without restraint. Fire stopped being a threat. Her daughter's own nature stopped being a threat. That's the actual resolution of the story, and it's communicated through a woman's relationship with an element rather than through any dialogue. If you want to know whether a production is thoughtful, that's the kind of thing to look for. I keep circling back to the question of what makes this drama land when so many with similar premises don't, and I think the answer is that it never once treats Lyra's suffering as romantic. There's a whole subgenre of story where the abandoned woman's pain is essentially aesthetic. She suffers beautifully, in rain, in silk, and her suffering exists to make the man's eventual regret more delicious. This show refuses that at every turn. Lyra's suffering is ugly and practical. It looks like counting coins. It looks like lying to a landlord. It looks like being too tired to be kind to her own kid and hating herself for it. It looks like a woman with cracked hands and a cough she can't afford to treat. By making her pain unglamorous, the show makes her dignity real. You can't pity her, because she's too competent. You can only respect her, and be furious on her behalf, and want better for her. And that fury is what makes Cale's redemption arc work as drama, because you spend the entire show not wanting him to succeed. You're actively rooting against reconciliation for probably 10 episodes. The writers know this. They're counting on it. They make you resist, and then they wear you down with tiny evidence, the same way Lyra is worn down, so that by the time you accept him you've had the same experience she has. That's an audience manipulation strategy of real sophistication, and I have to tip my hat to it. Let me pull one more scene apart, because I don't think I've done justice to the confrontation between Cale and Morin, and it's a genuine highlight. The setting is the Orders in a library. Not a dungeon, not a throne room, a library. Warm lamplight, wooden ladders, the smell of paper implied by the way the light catches dust. The show returns to fragments of it later, brief, half-second flashes, always from Lyra's POV, always intrusive rather than romantic. She doesn't get to enjoy the memory. It ambushes her. That's a mature depiction of what it's like to have a good memory poisoned by what came after. The show never lets the audience luxuriate in the romance of it, because Lyra can't. There's a corresponding scene late in the series where they're physically close again for the first time, and it's not a love scene, it's Cale helping her with an injured shoulder, and the way it's shot deliberately echoes the framing of that first night. Same close lens. Same shallow focus. But the lighting is completely different. Flat and domestic instead of gold and dreamlike. It's the same intimacy, stripped of fantasy. They're not two beautiful strangers in a myth anymore. They're two tired people in a kitchen. And the drama frames that as an upgrade. Which brings me to what I think this show is ultimately arguing, underneath the dragons and the caldera and the political archive burning, that romance, as a genre, has been selling us the wrong climax. The climax isn't the union. The union is easy. Anybody can have a night. The climax is the 10,000 ordinary mornings after somebody has already failed you once, and the daily decision to show up anyway. Deny me, Dragon King builds an entire 20-episode structure to arrive at a man on a roof in the rain fixing a stranger's shingles while the woman he wrecked watches from below and decides, slowly, over weeks, that this might be a person now. That's the thesis. Everything else is scaffolding. Now, I want to spend some real time on the parts of this drama that didn't work for me, because I've been fairly glowing and a review that only praises isn't worth much. The Northern Clan subplot, as I mentioned, is the clearest misfire. It's introduced with real weight around episode 12, a warlord named Draven who has legitimate grievances about resource allocation and a personal history with Cale's father. There's a whole sequence establishing his camp, his followers, the specific injustice that radicalized him. The show spends money on this. And then, after the archive revelation, he's resolved in a single line of reported dialogue. He's stood down, he's negotiating, it's fine. That's not a conclusion, that's an abandonment. Either commit or cut it. I suspect there was more of this thread in an earlier draft and it got sacrificed for time, but the seams show. Second issue, the Order's collapse is a little too tidy. I praise the archive scene, and I stand by it as a piece of drama, but the aftermath moves fast. 3 centuries of institutional power do not evaporate in 2 episodes because someone read a list. I wanted more resistance. I wanted a faction that doubled down, that said yes, and we were right to do it. The show gives us Morin's unrepentance, which is good, but is isolated. Historically, institutions under threat don't produce one unrepentant leader. They produce thousands of ordinary people who'd rather not think about it. A scene of a village priest quietly continuing the old rites after the ban, with nobody stopping him, would have been worth 10 council scenes. Third, Iowin's motivations get a little muddy in the final act. Their stated goal is recognition for mixed blood, and they achieve a version of it, but there are hints throughout that they want something more radical, a restoration, maybe a reckoning, and the show never resolves the tension between Iowin's politics and Lyra's desire for a quiet life. There's a scene where Iowan looks at Amber with an expression that is not entirely benevolent, and I kept waiting for that to pay off. It doesn't. It's either a deliberate ambiguity or a dropped thread, and I honestly can't tell which. Fourth, and this is more of a taste thing, the drama occasionally over-explains its own metaphors. Iowan has a monologue in the ruins about how the wards were never protection. They were a fence, and I thought, we got it. We got it 2 episodes ago when the child's fever spiked in the most heavily warded building in the kingdom. Trust the image. The show is so good at visual argument that the moments where it verbalizes the subtext feel like a lack of confidence. There's also a stretch of dialogue in the midsection where characters explain political stakes to each other that they would obviously already know. Classic fantasy problem. As you are aware, Chancellor, the Eastern houses have long resented the tithe. Nobody talks like that. The show is mostly good about this and then occasionally isn't. But I want to weigh these against what it gets right, because the ratio matters. 4 real flaws across 20 episodes, none of which touch the central relationship or the thematic spine, is a very good record for a genre production of this scale. And there's a category of thing this drama does that I don't have a neat name for, but I'd call it emotional accuracy about power. Small example. After Kale loses his flame, there's a scene where he tries to open a heavy door and struggles. Just struggles. Puts his shoulder into it. A servant sees, moves to help, and then hesitates, because helping the former king implies he needs help, and nobody has figured out the new etiquette yet. Kale notices the hesitation. The servant notices him noticing. And they both just stand there in this tiny agony of unclear social protocol until Kale says, please, and the servant helps, and neither of them looks at the other. Nobody writes that. That's a scene about the machinery of deference breaking down, and it takes 20 seconds, and it tells you more about Kale's new life than any amount of dialogue could. Another one. Lyra, back in the village, is offered a better house by a local official who has heard she's connected to the crown. She refuses. He insists. She refuses again. And then, later, alone, she sits at her old table and puts her head in her hands, because she wanted the house and she can't take it, because taking it would mean her comfort is once again contingent on a man's favor. The show doesn't explain this. It just shows her wanting and refusing. I think about that scene more than most of the big ones, which is a decent summary of my whole experience with this drama, honestly. The spectacle is competent. The caldera looks great. The dragon effects are used sparingly and therefore effectively. Morin is shelving something when Kale arrives, and he doesn't stop. He keeps shelving. That's the power move, refusing to be interrupted. Kale stands there for a moment. Then he sits down, uninvited, in a reading chair, like a student. The camera stays wide for most of the scene, both men small in the frame, surrounded by shelves. The staging communicates it perfectly. They are both inside a structure much larger than either of them. Morin talks first, and is warm. Genuinely warm. He asks after Kale's health. He mentions a book he thinks Kale would enjoy. And Kale lets him. And the awful thing is you can see that Kale loves this man a little, or used to, or was raised to. Then Kale asks about the prophecy, and Morin doesn't deny it for even a second. That's the chilling part. He says yes, immediately, and then explains his reasoning as if he expects agreement. The dialogue in this exchange is the best in the show. Morin's argument is essentially utilitarian. A few ruined lives against generations of stability, and he genuinely believes he's the one who took on the moral burden so that kings wouldn't have to. He says, "You have never had to decide who is expendable. I have decided it 100 times, and I have never once slept badly, because the alternative was a country in flames." And Kale says, "You decided my daughter was expendable before she existed." Morin's response, "I decided your dynasty was more important than your happiness. That is what I am for." There's a long pause. The lamp flickers. And then Kale asks the name question, and Morin doesn't know, and the whole justification collapses, not because Morin realizes he was wrong, but because we realize his stability argument was never examined. He's a man who did terrible arithmetic and never checked his work. Kale leaves. Doesn't touch him. And the camera holds on Morin alone in the library afterward, and he goes back to shelving books. That final image is the show's sharpest indictment. Evil, in this story, is a man returning to his filing. I want to acknowledge something about my own reaction to this drama that I've been dancing around, and it's the reason my rating is probably a little higher than strictly objective analysis would support. I watched most of this over 4 nights during a period when I was dealing with some family stuff I'm not going to get into. Specifically, some old stuff, involving an apology that never came and probably won't. And this show is essentially a 20-hour argument about what a real apology looks like, that it isn't words, that it isn't a single grand act, that it's an ongoing change in behavior sustained over years without any guarantee of being accepted. Watching Kale show up, day after day, to a woman who has not promised him anything, was weirdly medicinal for me. Not because I think anyone owes anyone forgiveness, but because the show articulated something I hadn't been able to put into words, that the value of an apology is in the repair work, not in the reception. There's a moment where Kale says to Iowan, near the end, "She may never forgive me." And Iowan says, "Then you'll have been useful anyway." I wrote that down. I don't usually write things down. So take my enthusiasm with that context. This show hit me at the right time in the wrong way, which is often when art actually gets you. Coming back to more solid analytical ground, I want to talk about how the drama handles time, because its use of the years-long gap is unusually skillful for the format. Most dramas that do a time skip treat it as a reset. New hair, new job, new confidence. This one treats it as accumulation. Lyra doesn't come back transformed, she comes back weathered. Her competence isn't new. It's the residue of years of small crises solved alone. And crucially, the show occasionally shows us fragments of those years, not in a big flashback episode, but in tiny inserted moments, usually triggered by something in the present. Amber asks for a specific bedtime song and we get 3 seconds of a much younger Amber in a much colder room. Someone mentions a border checkpoint and we get a flash of Lyra hiding a feverish toddler under a blanket in a cart. These fragments are never explained. They are just deposited. By the end, you feel like you lived those years even though you saw maybe 6 minutes of them. That's economical, confident filmmaking. The other thing the time gap does is make Kale's absence structural rather than emotional. He didn't miss a dramatic event. He missed the ordinary accumulation of a person. He missed the developing of preferences. He doesn't know that Amber hates the texture of certain fruit, or that she talks in her sleep, or that she's afraid of a specific type of bird. And the show has him learn these things slowly, and each discovery is framed as a small grief, because each one is a thing he should already know. There's a devastating little exchange where he offers her food and she refuses and he doesn't know why, and Lyra says, from across the room, without looking up, "Not the seeds." 2 words. Entire relationship gap illuminated. I've been asked before how you tell whether a drama's writers actually like their characters, and my answer is, watch how they handle the character's competence. Bad writing makes characters stupid to generate plot. Good writing lets characters be smart and generates plot from the collision of smart people with incompatible goals. By that measure, deny me, Dragon King is well written. Lyra is never stupid. Kale is never stupid after his initial catastrophic error, and even that error is dramatized as ideological rather than idiotic. Serafa is extremely smart. Morin is smart and wrong. Iowan is possibly the smartest person in the show. Nobody fails to see an obvious solution because the plot needs it. The one exception is a sequence in episode 13 where Lyra makes a choice, going alone to meet a supposed contact. That reads as slightly out of character for someone that cautious. It's a small thing and the show gives her a reason, but it's the one moment where I felt the machinery. Compare that to the number of dramas where the entire second act runs on people refusing to have a 5-minute conversation, and you'll appreciate the discipline. Let me pivot to something I think is genuinely under-discussed, the show's treatment of motherhood as a form of political resistance. Lyra never sets out to challenge the order. She has no ideology. She doesn't care about the archive or the dynasty or the purity doctrine. Her entire agenda is, keep this child alive. But because the state has organized itself around the proposition that a child shouldn't exist, the simple act of keeping Amber alive becomes an act of rebellion. That's such a rich idea and the drama plays it beautifully, because Lyra keeps getting frustrated by people trying to make her a symbol. Iowan wants her to be a restoration. Kale wants her to be an absolution. The reformist faction wants her to be a figurehead. And she keeps saying, in various ways, "No, I just want my kid to sleep through the night." There's a scene where a young priest who defected from the order comes to her, tearful, calling her an inspiration, and Lyra is visibly uncomfortable and eventually says, "I didn't do anything. I just didn't stop." Which is, of course, exactly what makes her an inspiration, and the show is smart enough not to have anyone point that out. The relationship between Lyra and Amber deserves more attention than most reviews have given it, honestly, because it's the actual central relationship of the drama. The romance is the plot. The mother-daughter bond is the heart. And it's not idealized. They fight. Amber, once she's healthy, becomes a fairly normal kid, which means she becomes occasionally awful. There's a late scene where she yells that she wishes she'd stayed at the palace because there were more interesting things there, and Lyra absorbs it without flinching and then goes and sits outside again, in the cold, for 1 minute. The callback to that gesture is exquisite. It's the same gesture from the illness episodes, but now the cause is completely different. Now it's just ordinary parenting hurt instead of terror. The show is saying, the crisis is over, but the labor never ends. And Cale, watching from a distance, learns what that minute means, and the next time it happens he goes outside and stands next to her without saying anything. Which is, I would argue, the actual romantic climax of the drama. Not a kiss. Two people standing in the cold for 1 minute. Okay, I want to address the fandom discourse a bit, because there's been a persistent argument about the ending that I think misses the point, and it concerns Amber's future. The complaint goes, the show sets up Amber as this world historical figure, the bridge, the returning line, the proof that changes everything, and then the ending gives her a village school. People feel cheated. They wanted the payoff of the setup. Here's my counter. The setup was never a promise. It was a warning. Everyone who calls Amber a bridge in this show is a person who wants to use her. Iowin's bridge line is not a prophecy, it's an ambition. The reformists' framing of her as a unifier is a political strategy. The show consistently codes symbolic language about Amber as a red flag. So the ending isn't a failure to deliver on setup. It's the deliberate refusal of the setup. The story asks, what will this child become? And answers a child, which is what she should have been allowed to be from the start. If you find that unsatisfying, that's a legitimate taste response. But I don't think it's a structural flaw. I think it's the thesis. And, look, there's also a slightly cynical reading available where the ending leaves the door open for a continuation and Amber's larger destiny is being held in reserve. I don't love that possibility, but I'd be lying if I said the final shot of that door swinging partially closed didn't feel like a production keeping its options open. If a second season materializes and immediately turns Amber into a chosen one, I will be back here complaining, loudly, and you can all watch me eat my words with a spoon. Speaking of which, brief aside, I've noticed I have a real weakness for endings when nothing happens. Give me a finale where two characters do dishes and I'm crying, but put a giant battle in and I'm checking my phone. I don't know what that says about me. Probably that I'm tired. Anyway, the action, when it does appear, is handled with an interesting philosophy. It's always short and always ugly. There's no choreography or spectacle. Fights last 10 to 15 seconds, they're shot mostly in medium and wide so you can see what's happening, and they end badly for someone in a way that has consequences. The best of them is the ambush on the road in episode 16, which is genuinely tense because Cale can't use his fire without hurting Amber. So a Dragon King fights a handful of soldiers with a sword, badly, because he's never had to. He gets hurt. He wins by luck and desperation. And afterward he sits on the ground shaking, and Lyra has to bandage him, and neither of them mentions that he was almost useless. Undermining your own protagonist's power fantasy is a bold choice and it pays off, because it makes the eventual sacrifice mean something. He doesn't give up his flame after a series of triumphant displays. He gives it up after we've already watched it become a liability. Sound design deserves one more mention because of a specific choice I noticed on rewatch. Dragon Fire, throughout the series, has a low subsonic component. It's mixed to be felt. And after Cale's sacrifice, that frequency disappears from the mix entirely for the remaining episodes. The soundscape is thinner, lighter. You don't consciously notice, but the physical sensation of the show changes. Then, in the final episode, when Amber scorches the hedge, the subsonic comes back, briefly, and higher, and smaller. The fire moved generations. That's the kind of detail that makes me want to shake the sound team's hand. Let me spend a little time on the supporting cast, who I've mostly neglected. There's a palace servant named Tesha who becomes quietly important. She's the one who brings Lyra food during the palace episodes, and she's the one who notices Amber's fever pattern before anyone else, and she has maybe 15 lines across the whole series. But the actress plays her with this alert, careful watchfulness that suggests an entire interior life. And there's a small reveal late on that Tesha's own grandmother was one of the erased, that she's been quietly protecting mixed-blood people for years within the palace, a one-woman underground. It's a lovely thread and I wish there'd been more of it. Honestly. I'd watch a whole series about Tesha. The council members are mostly functional, but there's one, an elderly lord who is initially hostile to Lyra and gradually shifts, who gets a beautiful small arc. His change isn't dramatic. He just stops speaking against her, and then one day he holds a door, and then eventually he's the one who seconds Seraph's corroboration in the archive scene. Change portrayed as a slow reduction in hostility rather than a conversion. Very realistic. And then there's Kale's captain of guard, Run, who serves as the show's conscience by proximity. He's loyal, he's not a schemer, and he's the one who tells Kale the hard truths at exactly the wrong times. There's a great moment where Kale, mid-crisis, asks him what he'd do, and Run says, "I'd have gone after her the next morning, my king," and then just stands there while that lands. The look on Kale's face. 12 episodes of self-justification collapsing because a soldier said the obvious thing. I do have a criticism of the supporting cast overall, though. The show doesn't give the human village characters nearly as much texture as the Dragon Court characters. Lyra's years in the border towns are populated by relatively generic figures. A kind neighbor, a stern landlord, a suspicious official. Given that the drama's whole moral position is that ordinary human life is more valuable than court spectacle, that's an odd imbalance. I wanted a real human friend for Lyra, someone who knew her before, someone who could tell us who she was. She's oddly isolated for a woman who lived somewhere for 9 years. That absence weakens the final act slightly, because when she settles in the village at the end, it doesn't feel like a homecoming to a community. It feels like a house with 3 people in it. Small thing, but a missed opportunity. I should also flag some content considerations for anyone deciding whether to watch. The illness material is sustained and detailed, and if you have a sick kid or you've had one, some of those sequences will be rough. The show is not gratuitous, but it is unflinching. There's also a strong thread of institutional cruelty toward children specifically. The archive list includes children, and the show says so plainly. It's not depicted, but it's stated, and it lands hard. The intimacy is present but not extended. It's shot suggestively rather than explicitly. Violence is infrequent and not lingered on. And tonally, be aware, this is a heavy watch for its first 2/3. If you're looking for a comfort fantasy romance with banter and adventure, you will be very surprised around episode 4 when the show cuts to a woman walking out of a palace into wet ash and stays with her for 6 unbroken minutes. Which, by the way, I still think is the boldest single edit in the whole series. 6 minutes. No score. A woman walking. The show telling you, early, exactly what kind of story you signed up for.